Dr. Evangelista and a colleague are unearthing quite deep down a large fragment of pottery. Does that piece of pottery really correspond to the time scale at that level of excavation? Almost certainly not. Working over this large area, they found that different parts of the cave had been occupied at different times, which complicated the interpretation. This fragment of pottery clearly belongs to the time of the jar burial people and had been carried to a deeper level, probably by the diggings of the Tabon bird. This shows how cautious archaeologists must be in ascribing periods to what they find. Its position must be plotted on the working map by the draftsman Manuel Santiago. Enormous quantities of soil were removed by the archaeological team during the months and months of work that spread over a period of no less than 4 years. Every single barrow load of soil had to be put into the screen, where the mesh is only 1/8 of an inch, and then had to be sifted by the patient Peter. Nothing must be allowed to escape the attention of the archaeologist. The tiniest fragments must be examined and carefully handled. Besides Tabon, many other caves honeycomb the limestone cliffs of Lipuan Point. Ladders, constructed now, as in the past, of rattan and bamboo, are often the only way to reach them. And up such ladders, men long ago must have climbed to place their burial jars in high places. Among the tangled mass of jungle trees and vines, at least 200 other caves and rock shelters have so far been discovered. And Victor Declan was amongst the first to explore these caves, in which no less than 1,500 burial jars were discovered in varying states of preservation. The topmost level looked so inaccessible that no one dreamed there could be jars up there. But Victor managed to scale the cliff and in the Manungal cave made an astonishing discovery. Reconstruction in the museum produced this jar. Incised and painted designs decorate the shoulders and the lid which protected the human bones within. The boat needs eyes in the front to help convey the spirit of the dead man, seated with crossed arms in the prow and steered by a man with a paddle behind, across the dark seas into the world beyond. This must be one of the most beautiful and moving Neolithic works found anywhere in the world. That particular jar was made in the 8th century BC, and all the other 1,500 jars date from nearly 2000 BC right down to 500 AD, a tremendous span of history for the jar burial people here. For men to negotiate these sheer cliffs, clinging to vines, and at the same time encumbered with the heavy jars of the dead, was a tremendous feat, and it shows how Neolithic men spared no pains in their determination to honor their ancestors and to provide them with noble resting places high above the South China Sea. Jars were used by the Tagwana people for burials within living memory, and they're still used for other religious rituals. A Chinese stoneware jar of the 18th century is being prepared by Pito, who worked with the museum staff in the Tabon caves. At home in his own village, he is a spirit medium. The Tagwana believe that the spirits of their ancestors are still with them, and if offended by neglect or by breaking of promises, then they will be outraged, and the children of the living will suffer by falling sick. The jar, filled with rice wine, is carried and set down on the matting outside the house. Drinking of rice wine is an important part of the ritual for getting into the right state to communicate with the ancestors. The women of the village have brought their children to Pito, the spirit medium, to receive through him the blessing of their grandparents and great-grandparents, and to have their heads touched with talismans, in the hope that by this contact with the spirits of the dead, they will be shielded from sickness. The sea all around Tabon Point is fairly shallow, which makes it suitable for this large type of fish trap. Built by local Filipinos, it's the kind of fishing gear employed throughout the South China Sea, but which is not found further east in the Pacific. This is one amongst many indications that the present-day inhabitants of the Philippines are culturally linked with the peoples of Southeast Asia, though whether this was always so in the remote past is open to question. For thousands of years ago, the level of the sea was quite different. Dr. Fox is making his way up to another cave, the story of which is connected with their change in the sea level. The huge stalactites have been formed during millions of years by the slow dripping of water and the steady deposit of limestone. The stalactites growing downwards from the ceiling and the stalagmites upwards from the ground. These growing shapes and vivid colors belong, of course, to geological time. But the floor of this long, narrow cave, when the explorers first came here, was covered with the jars of the jar burial people. And right at the far end, there still rests one of these jars for the bones of the dead, now firmly embedded in the wall and deeply encrusted with limestone. At the other end of the cave, near the giant stalactite at the mouth, was the area that proved most interesting for the archaeologists. It was here that the masses of marine shells were dug up, and Dr. Fox explains their significance in early Philippine history.
About 1/2 kilometer away from Tabon Cave, in the same limestone cliffs, is Guri Cave. This cave is of immense importance to archaeologists in the Philippines. Here, for the first time, we excavated thousands of seashells, shellfish, which had been eaten and left in the cave by man. In Tabon Cave, on the contrary, not one seashell was excavated. Tabon Cave was occupied from about 9,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, precisely when a land bridge existed which connected the Philippines with Borneo and ultimately to the mainland of Asia. And we calculate that the seacoast was about 35 kilometers away from the mouth of the cave. Guri Cave was occupied about 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, when the sea level had reached its present position and shellfish were readily available for food.
Guri Cave was first occupied 8,000 years ago at the end of